Listen to a conversation between a student and a professor.
Hey, Jane, you look like you're in a hurry.
Yeah, things are a little crazy.
Oh, yeah, what's going on?
Oh, it's nothing. Well, since it's your class, I guess it's okay. It's just that I'm having trouble with my group project.
Yes, due next week? What's your group doing again?
It's about United States Supreme Court decisions. We're looking at the impact of recent cases on property rights, municipal land use cases, zoning disputes.
Right, okay, and it's not going well?
Not really. I'm worried about the other two people in my group. They're just sitting back, not really doing their fair share of the work, and waiting for an A. It's kind of stressing me out because we're getting close to the deadline and I feel like I'm doing everything for this project.
The good old free rider problem.
Free rider?
Oh, it's just a term that describes this situation when people in a group seek to get the benefits of being in the group without contributing to the work. Anyway, what exactly do you mean when you say they just sit back? I mean, they've been filing their weekly progress reports with me.
Yes, but I feel like I'm doing 90% of the work. I hate to sound so negative here, but honestly, they're taking credit for things they shouldn't be taking credit for. Like last week in the library, we decided to split up the research into 3 parts, and then each of us was supposed to find sources in the library for our parts. I went off to the stacks and found some really good material for my part, but when I got back to our table, they were just goofing off and talking. So I went and got material for their sections as well.
You shouldn't do that.
I know, but I didn't want to risk the project going down the drain.
I know Teresa and Kevin. I've had both of them in other courses, so I'm familiar with their work and their work habits.
I know, me too, and that's why this has really surprised me.
Does your group like your topic?
Well, I think we'd all rather focus on cases that deal with personal liberties, questions about freedom of speech, things like that. But I chose property rights.
You chose the topic?
Yeah, I thought it would be good for us, all of us, to try something new.
Maybe that's part of the problem. Maybe Teresa and Kevin aren't that excited about the topic. And since you picked it, have you talked to them at all about picking a different topic?
But we've already got all the sources, and it's due next week. We don't have time to start from scratch.
Okay, well, I'll let you go because I know you're so busy, but you might consider talking to your group about your topic choice?
I'll think about it. Gotta run. See you in class.
Listen to part of a lecture in a geology class.
Now, we've got a few minutes before we leave for today, so I'll just touch on an interesting subject that I think makes an important point. We've been covering rocks and different types of rocks for the last several weeks. But next week, we're going to do something a little bit different. And to get started, I thought I'd mention something that shows how, as a geologist, you need to know about more than just rocks and the structure of solid matter. Moving rocks. You may have heard about them. It's quite a mystery. Death Valley is this desert plain, a dry lake bed in California, surrounded by mountains. And on the desert floor are these huge rocks, some of them hundreds of pounds. And they move. They leave long trails behind them, tracks, you might say, as they move from one point to another. But nobody has been able to figure out how they're moving, because no one has ever seen it happen. Now, there are a lot of theories, but all we know for sure is that people aren't moving the rocks. There are no footprints, no tire tracks, and no heavy machinery, like a bulldozer. Nothing was ever brought in to move these heavy rocks. So, what's going on? Theory number 1, wind. Some researchers think powerful windstorms might move the rocks. Most of the rocks move in the same direction as the dominant wind pattern, from southwest to northeast, but some, and this is interesting, move straight west, while some zigzag or even move in large circles. How can that be? How about wind combined with rain? The ground of this desert is made of clay. It's a desert, so it's dry. But when there is the occasional rain, the clay ground becomes extremely slippery. It's hard for anyone to stand on, walk on. So, one theory was that perhaps when the ground is slippery, high winds can then move the rocks. But 5 or 10 years ago, a team of scientists tested that theory. They experimented by flooding an area of the desert with water, and then trying to establish how much wind force would be necessary to move the rocks. They calculated that it would take winds of at least 500 miles an hour to move the rocks. And since winds that strong don't occur anywhere on Earth, they concluded that the wind wasn't the cause, even with slippery ground. Now, more recent research suggests that it would take winds of only 150 miles an hour, not 500. But even winds that strong don't occur in Death Valley. So the original experiment's conclusion that wind is not the culprit seems right. Here's another possibility. Ice. It's possible that rain on the desert floor could turn to thin sheets of ice when temperatures drop at night. So, if rocks become embedded in ice, could a piece of ice with rocks in it be pushed around by the wind? That makes sense, but there's a problem with this theory too. Rocks trapped in ice together would have moved together when the ice moved. But that doesn't always happen. The rocks seem to take separate routes. Nevertheless, ice is probably involved. We just don't quite know how yet. And of course, there are other theories. Maybe the ground vibrates, or maybe the ground itself is shifting, tilting. Maybe the rocks are moved by a magnetic force. But sadly, all these ideas have been eliminated as possibilities. There's just not enough evidence. I bet you're saying to yourself, well, why don't scientists just set up video cameras to record what actually happens? Thing is, this is a protected wilderness area, so by law, that type of research isn't allowed. Besides, in powerful windstorms, sensitive camera equipment would be destroyed. So why can't researchers just live there for a while until they observe the rocks moving? Same reason. So where are we now? Well, despite some recent progress, we still don't have definite answers. So all this leads back to my main point. You need to know about more than just rocks as geologists. The researchers studying moving rocks, well, they combined their knowledge of rocks with knowledge of wind, ice, and such. Not successfully, not yet, but, they wouldn't even have been able to get started without earth science understanding, knowledge about wind, storms, meteorology. You need to understand physics. So, for several weeks, like I said, we'll be addressing geology from a wider perspective. Well, I guess that's all for today. See you next time.
Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
Most of the rocks move in the same direction as the dominant wind pattern, from southwest to northeast, but some, and this is interesting, move straight west, while some zigzag or even move in large circles. How can that be?
What does the professor imply when he says this?
But some, and this is interesting, move straight west, while some zigzag or even move in large circles. How can that be?
Listen to part of a discussion in a United States government class.
Okay, last time we were talking about government support for the arts. Who can sum up some of the main points? Frank?
Well, I guess there wasn't really any, official government support for the arts until the 20th century. But the first attempt the United States government made to support the arts was the Federal Art Project.
Right. So what can you say about the project?
It was started during the Depression, in the 1930s to employ out-of-work artists.
So was it successful? Janet, what do you say?
Yeah, sure. It was successful. I mean, for one thing, the project established a lot of, community art centers and, galleries in places like rural areas where people hadn't really had access to the arts.
Right.
Yeah, but didn't the government end up wasting a lot of money for art that wasn't even very good?
Some people might say that, but wasn't the primary objective of the federal art project to provide jobs?
That's true. I mean, it did provide jobs for thousands of unemployed artists.
Right, but then when the United States became involved in the Second World War, unemployment was down, and it seemed that these programs weren't really necessary any longer. So, moving on. We don't actually see any real government involvement in the arts again until the early 1960s, when President Kennedy and other politicians started to push for major funding to support and promote the arts. It was felt by a number of politicians that the government had a responsibility to support the arts as sort of, what can we say, the soul or spirit of the country. The idea was that there'd be a federal subsidy, financial assistance to artists and artistic or cultural institutions. And for just those reasons, in 1965, the National Endowment for the Arts was created. So it was through the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, that the arts would develop, would be promoted throughout the nation. And then individual states throughout the country started to establish their own state arts councils to help support the arts. There was kind of a cultural explosion, and by the mid-1970s, by 1974, I think, all 50 states had their own arts agencies, their own state arts councils that worked with the federal government, with corporations, artists, performers, you name it.
Did you just say corporations? How are they involved?
Well, you see, corporations aren't always altruistic. They might not support the arts unless the government made it attractive for them to do so by offering corporations tax incentives to support the arts. That is, by letting corporations pay less in taxes if they were patrons of the arts. The Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., maybe you've been there, or Lincoln Center in New York. Both of these were built with substantial financial support from corporations. And the Kennedy and Lincoln Centers aren't the only examples. Many of your cultural establishments in the United States will have a plaque somewhere acknowledging the support, the money they've received from whatever corporation. Oh, yes, Janet?
But aren't there a lot of people who don't think it's the government's role to support the arts?
Well, as a matter of fact, a lot of politicians who did not believe in government support for the arts, they wanted to do away with the agency entirely for that very reason, to get rid of governmental support. But they only succeeded in taking away about half the annual budget. And as far as the public goes, well, there are about as many individuals who disagree with government support as there are those who agree. In fact, with artists in particular, you have lots of artists who support and who have benefited from this agency, although it seems that just as many artists oppose a government agency being involved in the arts for many different reasons. Reasons like they don't want the government to control what they create. In other words, the arguments both for and against government funding of the arts are as many and as varied as the individual styles of the artists who hold them.
Listen again to part of the discussion, then answer the question.
Yeah, but didn't the government end up wasting a lot of money for art that wasn't even very good?
Some people might say that, but wasn't the primary objective of the federal art project to provide jobs?
What does the professor imply when she says this?
Some people might say that, but wasn't the primary objective of the federal art project to provide jobs?